In this three-part series, we're going to hopefully get you started doing some simple sewing by, in part one, showing you the basic structures of the machine that are common to all machines and how you'll be able to recognize them and use your machine more effectively. In part two, we'll show you threading of both the bobbin and the top of the machine so that you can get ready to sew your project. And in part three, we'll show you some tips for sewing and do a little bit of troubleshooting, helping you through some of those minor problems that might come up. Let's begin with the fundamental thing. How are you going to turn the machine on and where's the power source going to be? So most machines have a system where they're going to use either a one-cord system or a two-cord system. So this old Husqvarna has one cord that connects into the machine, and one of those wires that leaves it goes to the power source, and one is going to go to the power foot itself, or the foot that's going to, you're going to treat this like a gas pedal, and you're going to run the machine by pressing harder or softer on the pedal. This FAF machine has a two-part power source. One cord goes to the power foot that's going to run the machine, and the other cord goes to the plug-in. There's no confusing those two cords. They are very, very different, so you don't have to worry about that. The Bernina, again, has the one cord connection, but you can see the two cords that are going to send into the wall and down to the power foot. And this little Euro Pro has the two cords. Again, two different size openings there, so you're not going to make a mistake and accidentally plug the machine in incorrectly. You will want to work with the light on your machine. You're going to want to light your work area, and so you're going to want to be able to turn the power on and have some lighting as well. So on the Husqvarna machine, once it's plugged in, it will run. But you can also switch on a light. It's underneath in here in the harp area of the machine. On the FAF, once you turn the machine on, the light comes on. Different machines will do different things. This Bernina has essentially two settings. I can let power into the machine so that it will run without the light. Not very often that you need that. Usually I turn it right up to the top and then I'm going to get some light. And this little Euro Pro machine, when you turn the machine off and on, you're going to get some light. And I just want to highlight this little machine because I don't endorse this machine at all. It looks nice. Sometimes you can, oh wow, I bought a sewing machine for $50, but you're definitely going to get what you pay for. This light on this machine is so ineffective, you would definitely need some extra light in your workspace before you could even sew with it. So you've got your machine turned on, and now you're looking to see, okay, what are my basic things that these machines are going to tell me? So the first thing we want to look at is the machine is pretty much going to tell you what it can do. And you're going to look either on the front surface of the machine or the top area of the machine, and that's going to give you an idea of the kinds of stitches that this machine can make. So on this Husqvarna 2000, we have a whole listing of some utility stitches that could be used, and this machine, I suspect, was built because of the stretch and sew movement. When people started working with a lot of knit fabrics, we needed these stitches that would allow us to work effectively with knits. But it still has the basic dials. It's going to tell you how to make a zigzag and how to make a straight stitch. The FAF, a little bit high end, we're going to have a multitude of stitches that this machine can do, and they're just in a little plate underneath in the top of the machine here. But we've got our 18 most commonly used stitches right here at the beginning, and that's what we're going to focus on tonight. The Bernina has a number of utility stitches and just some little bit of stretch stitches, but they're all listed on the top of the machine here, and we're going to look at those and we're going to see how we can set the machine based on the information that's given here. The front of the little Euro Pro tells us that this machine can basically do 10 stitches. It can do a straight stitch in 3 positions, zigzags, a multi-stitch zigzag. Those are our 10 utility stitches, and then we've got the 4 stitches or the 4 settings for a buttonhole. It's a very simple machine, and this is probably the most complex machine that we're going to have. So let's learn some structures on the machine. We want to be able to effectively use the machine, how to start and stop, and we need to know some of the structures. So you'll notice that even though there are 4 different brands of machine, all of these machines have some things in common. On the right-hand side of the machine, there is always the hand wheel. That hand wheel is going to turn as the machine is running, and on most machines there will be an indication that tells you that that hand wheel should always be turned toward the front of the machine. So when the machine is sewing, this hand wheel will turn, and it will be turning toward the front of the machine, so that if when you stop and you want to manually turn it, you should also turn it toward the front of the machine. We will notice that sometimes, you get a thread stuck in underneath the needle plate, or you want to undo a stitch, or you want to sort of go backwards. You should not turn the hand wheel backwards. You can't undo a stitch once you've made it. Even when the machine is backstitching, this hand wheel is moving toward the front of the machine. So that's a commonality that we're always going to see on every sewing machine, that hand wheel that you will very quickly learn to turn toward yourself. Then we're going to need to know how to make the machine do various stitches. So most people, when they start sewing, they're going to be working with projects that involve a straight stitch or a backstitch, or sorry, straight stitch or a zigzag stitch. And that's what you're going to want to be able to control on the machine. So every machine will have that ability to set that either manually, like on these manual machines, or electronically, like on this FAF machine. So we'll start with this Husqvarna machine. We're going to look at the dials, and we're looking for some commonalities in symbols. And this one I didn't feel it was really intuitive. If we'd had the instruction booklet, of course, we could have read it and we would have known right away. So we're looking for the dial that's going to control whether or not the machine is doing a straight stitch or a zigzag. And through trial and error tonight, we realized it's this dial. A stitch width is how wide the stitch, or how much space, horizontal space, a stitch takes when it's being made. So a stitch width of 0 means there's no width being taken, and that of course is the setting for a straight stitch. So if I wanted this machine to do a straight stitch, I would need my width set at 0. I'm just going to skip the FAF for a second, and I'm going to go on to the Bernina, and I'm also looking at a little diagram on the machine that will tell me what I'm doing when I affect these dials. So there's this little symbol here that starts with a straight line and ends up with a zigzag. And again, that is my dial for stitch width. If my machine is set at 0, I am going to be making a straight stitch, and this machine can be set all the way over from 0 to 5, and I will get various widths of zigzag as I go from there. So if I just want to do a straight stitch, which is what I want to do most of the time, I make sure that my stitch width is set at 0. This little machine has it, and this might be something like the machine you have. It'll have settings that will tell you number 1 is a straight stitch, all right? And we notice that 1, 2, and 3 are just straight stitches with a needle in the middle of different lengths. So if I wanted to do stitch number 1, just a matter of turning this little dial so it matches the indicator so that it's set on number 1. It's a very simple machine, and that might be the machine that you have. When we get to the FAF machine, we have all of this right at our fingertips. We have all of this information right at our fingertips, but I go over here to the utility stitches, and I see that stitch number 1 is just a straight stitch, the needle in the middle, and it's of about an average length. So I'm going to look for a symbol that sort of tells me where's my menu, where are all my choices going to be. So I'm going to go to the menu one on this, and when I hit utility stitches, Up on the screen comes various settings for probably the 10 most popular stitches you're ever going to do on this machine. And there's my number 1, and it's a straight stitch. So I didn't have to tell the machine not to do a zigzag. I told it to do a straight stitch. Whereas on this machine, I have to tell it not to do a zigzag, but to do a straight stitch by setting this machine and this machine at 0. Then I will want to be able to control the distance that my machine makes the fabric travel every time I make a stitch, and that's stitch length. So on this machine, it happens to be this button, and again, the bigger the number, the longer the stitch. I believe they're usually measured in millimeters. On this machine, I am going to add and subtract these numbers that are on the screen. And so if I press the positive sign, it will then add usually a ½ millimeter at a time, and I'll get a stitch length that is set to the basic utility stitch, but then it's just going to add a little bit every time I add that on to there. On this machine, my stitch length button is down here by this symbol, which has 2 important functions this dial does. It's got the symbol for backstitching, and it's got the symbol for stitch length. So by simply turning this dial to the right or to the left and looking at that little line that sets beside it, I will be able to go from a stitch length of 0 all the way to a stitch length of 5, which is the longest stitch that this machine can make. Some higher end machines can go all the way up to 7 millimeters now. So just by turning that down, I'm creating the correct stitch length. Generally, for the typical sewing project, if you're sewing garments or a typical craft project, say a drawstring bag or something like that, you'd want a stitch length of about 2.5. So I usually leave my machine set at 2.5, and then I make adjustments as needed. So far, hand wheel. Turn the hand wheel towards yourself. Adjust your stitch width and your stitch length, and know how to adjust those to get a pretty good average length. We usually want a stitch length of about 2.5. The next thing you'd want to be able to do is to back stitch with your machine. So this machine has that little back stitch symbol. So by pushing this button down, that would cause this machine to back stitch, to literally go in reverse. On this machine, with the symbol being here, it's basically telling you that if you hold this dial up, you will be able to back stitch. On this machine, that little symbol is right under in here. So if I was running the machine and I push that button, for as long as I have it pushed, the machine will backstitch. And on this machine, it's this little button here. I'll push it in, and that will allow the machine to backstitch. So I have some real basic functioning. I can set the stitch width, I can set the stitch length, and I can make the machine backstitch or move forward. So there's just a couple of other buttons that you might notice on the machine. This doesn't really have any more, but this one does, and so does the Husqvarna. And this bottom button on the machine is going to be whether or not you can drop your feed dogs. So, all right, so just a closer look at those feed dogs then. You can see that under the presser foot on the free arm of the machine, there are those little teeth-like structures that are going to send the fabric back. And how they work is they come up and then they roll back. And so by grabbing onto the fabric, they roll it back and they make the fabric move backwards, and it appears as if the needle's going forward, but of course it isn't. So when we turn the feed dogs off, those feed dogs will drop down in and they'll no longer come up and grab on the fabric. When we engage them, they are now coming up and doing their job of pulling the fabric through the machine. If I set my stitch length at a longer length, what's happening is those feed dogs are making a much bigger bite into the length of that fabric and sending it back. And if I set it to a much shorter length, then they're just taking little baby steps and moving my fabric less. So as my needle is moving up and down, it's a matter of how much fabric is being fed through the machine at any time. All right, let's move on to then some of the basic structures that we need to be familiar with in order to actually thread the machine. we are going to notice that on the top of the machine and on the front of the machine are going to be very similar or analogous parts of the machine, but they may not look exactly alike. So let's take a look at the Husqvarna. If we viewed this machine right from the top, there really isn't a lot of information or a lot of pieces on the top of the machine. The thing that I would notice is the spool holders at the back of the machine off to the right-hand side. And then I would notice these pieces or these structures that are all going to be involved in threading the machine. So I'm going to have a thread guide at the back here. I've got a dial that has a measurement, and then this one is the one that puts the tension on the thread as it comes to the front. I've got a thread guide, this thread guide structure here. I've got this structure called the take-up lever. You will notice that when the machine is running, that take-up lever is moving up and down as the stitches are made. So that's absolutely vital to recognize the take-up lever on the machine. And you'll notice that it also has a channel. That take-up lever is threaded. So we have various thread guides. We have the area where the tension is put on the thread. We have another thread guide. Very often above the needle, we'll have a thread guide, and then we'll have the needle itself, and of course the presser foot, the actual structure that's going to hold the fabric in place and keep the fabric smoothly running through the machine as you're going. So we want to be able to understand where the needle goes into the machine and how to change a needle as well. So we'll get to all of that in just a few minutes, but I'll just show that on all of these machines. Thread guides for threading, the take-up lever, where the tension is put onto the thread, the needle clamp, the thing that holds the needle in place, the needle itself, and the presser foot. On the FAF machine, a lot of our workings are inside this cover, and that's protecting those inner workings from dust, and it also makes it a lot smoother in terms of storage and carrying it. So we're going to have, again, thread guides that are going to be involved in threading our machine. Our take-up lever is up here inside, protected on the top of the machine. Just kind of a funny story. Sometimes you'll be stitching and you'll be so intense with what you're doing, you will get so close to your machine that you will actually hit yourself with that take-up lever as it goes up and down. And that can really bruise your forehead. It's really a powerful little thing to get hit with. So this is nice. We know that will never happen when you're using the FAF machine. So thread guides, the take-up lever. We know that in these slots, these are going to guide the thread, and this is also where the tension is engaging because I have a little dial over here that is letting me adjust the tension, the top thread tension on this machine. So I know that that is working together with this little slot on the machine. I have very small thread guides in here, but that means that thread is held very close and it's not going to be flying all over the place. My needle is very much like on the Husqvarna. It's kind of in the central position, and then I have a presser foot. Now this machine also has a threading mechanism, a mechanism that will thread the needle. Not every machine has that. This machine is a little higher end than some of these other ones. All right, this machine has the parts quite obvious and visible on the outside. On the, okay, sorry. The Bernina machine's threading parts are very visible and very much to the top and front of the machine. So we again have the spool holder or the spool pin. We have a thread guide that's going to guide that thread to the front of the machine. And again, we have this little trench. Here's my dial to affect the top tension. So both the FAF and the Bernina, that's very clear that that's there on there, and it's going to be available for adjustment. A very similar thread guide to what we saw on the Husqvarna. We have our take-up lever sitting here, and then our thread's going to come down. This Bernina has a little thread guide extra for using a double needle. You probably won't worry about that with your beginner projects, but it has a thread guide to keep the thread close to the needle. There's my needle, and there's my presser foot. And I have a different presser foot on this machine than on those other two, and we'll talk about that eventually as well. So even this little machine has very similar structure. There's all of these parts that are the same. We have the spool holders. We have a little thread guide here. Here's a little sign of a thread guide that why it's less convenient. This one you actually have to thread that through. You're going to notice on these other machines that the thread is just going to smoothly find its path and it's going to go through, and I don't have to sort of thread it through anything until I get to the needle. This one I have to thread it through there. But again, I have a tension dial, so that means my thread is going to be tensioned here. Here's my take-up lever. Here's a little thread guide or a little hook that's going to hold on to that needle. Here's the needle, and here's the presser foot. So all of the machines have the similar kind of structure, just depending on where they're positioned. This machine, weirdly enough, has its needle clamp sticking out of the front. I can't imagine that that's good for light availability, but there it is. That's going to be able to be opened up, and you're going to be able to get the needle in and out. The Bernina needle clamp, and we can see that needle clamp on all of the machines. That's the place where we're going to be able to change the needle. So let's take a look at the sewing machine needle, its position on the machine, and how we're going to change it. We'll see that the needle, if we look at it closely, is sitting so that the eye travels from the front to the back of the machine. It travels straight through. So we have to make sure when we replace that needle that that's how that needle looks when we're done as well. We're going to notice that all needles have been put on with a little screw type device, and we're just going to need to loosen that little screw down. So I'm going to just hold on to my needle. I'm going to turn that little screw toward myself, just loosen it a little bit. I don't need to take that screw all the way out. I don't want to lose that on the floor and then have to go and find it. So my needle has come out of the machine, and let's talk about the fact that you really should put a new needle in often. Lots of people say new project, new needle. You can vary that a little bit depending if you've just sewn for 10 minutes and made, say, a hem on the bottom of a skirt. You probably don't need to change your needle. But sometimes when you've made a big project like a quilt or a pair of pajama pants, you should then put a new needle in your machine. The needle is vital in making a proper stitch. So I need that point to stay sharp or to stay undamaged when I'm sewing. Some needles will have a sharp point like this universal, and some will have a slightly rounded point like a ballpoint needle. For most cases, your needles that you're going to use are just going to be safe by using a universal needle. And if you get into more complex sewing, then your instructor would guide you as to what kind of needle to use. So take a close look at that needle at the top of the needle, and you'll see that one side of the needle has a flat surface and the other side has a round surface. Sewing machine needles have been made like this since the early 1900s. I have an old sewing machine from about 1918, and it takes this exact shape of needle. So that flat part is going to go to the back of the machine. It's going to face away from you when you go to put it back in the machine. And by doing that, you will ensure that that hole then runs straight from back to front. It's important that the needle be put in properly because the back side of the needle has a little depression in it that's going to allow the needle as it goes down into the machine to pass by another piece of metal in the bobbin case. And they have to run really close together and they have to mesh just perfectly. So I took my needle out by undoing that clamp a little bit. I took my needle out. We'll pretend this is a new needle, and I'm ready to put it back in. So I find that flat part. I'm going to insert the needle back into position, and I just have to find out where that opening is, and I must put that needle up as absolutely high as it can go. And then I'm going to tighten that clamp down again. And I want to be firm, not brutal, but firm, because I don't want this screw so loose that the needle can fall out when I run through a sticky or a thick piece of fabric. So my needle is pushed up high into the machine, as high as I can go, and then I have put the clamp on. That same technique would be used for any of these machines. So that's my new needle into my machine, and I'm ready to go. While we're focused on the needle plate, I just want to make a point about the needle plate on your machine. I'm going to lift my presser foot and I'm going to remove my presser foot off the machine. And we talked before about the feed dogs, and I just want you to notice on this needle plate some important points on that needle plate. So I want you to notice in the throat plate or the needle plate of your machine that that opening that the needle passes down as it goes through into the machine to catch the bobbin thread is an oval shape, and it has to be an oval shape when you're going to use certain stitches on your machine. So if my machine is just running in a straight line, it's going to pass through the very center of that oval, no problem. But if I set my machine to the widest zigzag that it can do, there still must be an opening through that metal plate that the needle can pass down through. So that's the widest zigzag my machine can do, and obviously my needle plate will allow that needle to pass down through no matter where I've set the zigzag. You'll notice that when I took my presser foot off, you will have noticed maybe that you can see that it was a presser foot that didn't have that big an opening. So I've got this presser foot for making quilts, for piecing quilts. And so I want the narrowest opening because I don't want my fabric to get caught down or to slide down in there through, which sometimes happens when you're sewing. So this presser foot is made especially because we generally know that when we're quilting, we're only ever going to be using a straight stitch. So if I put that foot on and I inadvertently set my machine to a zigzag, you can see that my presser foot isn't going to allow me to go down in through the needle plate, even though the needle plate would have allowed me to do it. So changing the foot on the machine is just a matter of either undoing the clamp that's holding that foot on. Possibly sometimes there's a spring load, but this machine has entire presser feet that are put back on. So I undid this clamp, I lifted it up, and now I've put my new foot on, and there's my, my oval opening. So this foot is the one that comes with the machine to just do regular utility stitches. So now this machine, or this foot, will allow me to do the full width of my possible zigzags, and of course a straight stitch as well. This particular foot also has the capability of just releasing the bottom portion of that foot, the part that interacts with the machine, and having a different structure attached so that I can do different kinds of stitches. So sometimes the foot is all one piece, and sometimes it comes in parts that you can interchange different parts. For regular sewing of projects that you're likely to be doing with crafts or garments or quilting, chances are you just need an oval opening and a flat, straight foot. It will have a couple of toes sticking out of the front, and often a guideline right down the middle to tell you where the needle is going to be traveling when the needle is in the middle. So it's helpful, especially when you're learning to sew and learning to control.